I'm the Great Bambino.
What?
I'm the Great Bambino.
What?
I'm the Great Bambino.
Oh.
Who's that?
I had no idea who they were talking about.
What did he say? What, were you born in a barn, man?
Yeah, what planet are you from?
But there was no way I could let them know.
You never heard of the Sultan of SWAT?
The Titan of Terror.
The Colossus of Clout? The Colossus of Clout.
The King of Trash, man.
So, I lied.
Oh, yeah, the Great Bambino. Of course. I thought you said the Great Bambi. That wimpy deer? Yeah, I guess. Sorry.
So for those of you who don't know, that movie is The Sandlot. It's a movie that came out when I was younger, so a long time ago now. Still one of the best, I think, kind of baseball movies of all time. But the reason why we show it is they kind of went through a string of names there, right, for Babe Ruth. And today we're going to be talking about names and what that means. And so I wanted to real quick kind of go through some others. So there's a lot of people whose names that if we mentioned their nicknames, everybody would know who we were talking about. So if I were to say Honest Abe, who is that? Abraham Lincoln. Hammerin', Hank. I didn't even have to say any other part of his, but just Hammerin'. Then you could go with The Rock, Dwayne Johnson. That's right. Who's the king of rock and roll? Elvis. So we could probably sit in here, I could literally just go through name after name after name. There's even a few in the Bible. The one whom Jesus loved. Who is that? John. John referred to himself that way, right? In his own writing, which is kind of funny in my opinion. And then there's another, and this is kind of where we're going to be sitting today or beginning today, and that's David. David was called a man after God's own heart. What I didn't even actually put together until I started doing this, getting prepared for this, he was called a man after God's own heart before he was even introduced to us in the Bible. It started back with Saul, and Saul had messed up, and I think Nathan actually preached on this a few weeks back. Saul had messed up, had stepped out of place and done a burnt offering in place of the priest because he wasn't being patient, and Samuel comes, the prophet Samuel comes to him and declares that a new king is coming. And in 1 Samuel 13:14, he says, "But now your kingdom shall not continue. The Lord has sought out a man after his own heart, and the Lord has commanded him to be prince over his people, because you have not kept what the Lord has commanded you." And so, even before we're introduced to David, we're told that a man after his own heart is coming. And I thought that was pretty powerful, because I think it speaks to the fact that Jesus knows who we are, God knows who we are, before we become who we're going to become. He knew that David was going to be the king. He knew all the things that David was going to accomplish before he was even introduced to us. And it was 3 chapters later in 1 Samuel 16 when we're introduced to David. And we're introduced to David because Samuel goes to the house of Jesse, David's father, and he says, "I'm here to anoint the coming king." And Jesse brings forth most of his sons. And slowly Samuel goes through each one and says, "Nope, not him, not him." And he gets through all the ones that are there, and he says, "Do you have any more?" And Jesse's kind of like, "Well, yeah, I got, David. He's out in the field taking care of the sheep." And David was just a shepherd boy when he was anointed to be king. So God knew exactly who David was when David was still only a shepherd boy. Just as whether you're a youth here or whether it's a child in the back in our children's ministry, God knows his plans for you already. God knows what's coming. And so David becomes king. And things are going pretty good. David's known as a kind of a fighting king, a warring king. He wins many battles. And then he goes through many struggles, though, too. Like many of us do. So David goes up on his rooftop one night. This is probably one of the more famous failures in all of the Bible. And he sees Bathsheba bathing. And instead of going back inside and going about his own business, he ends up having an affair with her. She gets pregnant. And so now he's got this problem. And he's got to figure out what to do because Bathsheba's married. She's not just somebody who's, out of wedlock, but she's actually married to somebody else. And she's not just married to somebody else, but she's actually married to one of his best soldiers, Uriah. And so David, in trying to figure out what to do, decides basically, I can go into all the details, but he basically has Uriah killed in battle. Because Uriah was too honorable when he brought him home from battle to even go in and be with his wife while his men were still out in the battlefield. And so David has him killed. And so now David has committed adultery. He's lied. He's basically committed murder. And we're stuck with a man who's called after a man after God's own heart, but he's made all these mistakes. I've always said that David's one of the only people in the Bible who is recorded to have broken all 10 commandments. Some of those might be a slight little stretch, but I wanted to literally go through them. So you shall have no other gods before me. No, I think he probably had a couple other gods before him when he stood on the roof and looked over at Bathsheba and then decided to have an affair with her. And there were things that he put before God. And then it says you shall make no idols. Well, there were definitely multiple idols there, whether it be lust, greed, whatever you want to say. There were many things that he put, again, before God. You shall not take the Lord your God's name in vain. This one's maybe arguable. He didn't literally maybe take his name in vain, but I don't think his actions spoke very well for who God was. Keep the Sabbath day holy. I don't think that on Saturday he just decided to be a good dude at this point in his life. Honor your father and mother. So I'm going to pause here for a second. A lot of you know this. Some of you don't. I had my first kid at 16. So I can speak to this and say when you get someone pregnant out of wedlock, it's not the most honorable thing you can do for your parents. My parents are here today. But, I'm sure that when I came and told them that, the thing that they weren't thinking was, wow, Matt, we feel so honored. Those weren't the words that came out of their mouths exactly. Although they loved me through it. You shall not murder. He had Uriah killed. These are really simply. You shall not commit adultery. See Bathsheba. You shall not steal. Pretty sure that Bathsheba was somebody else's wife. You shall not bear false witness. Told a lot of lies during this. You shall not covet. That's where it all started. So we have this conundrum of David being called a man after God's own heart, but just royally screwing up. And I don't think it's a coincidence that David is potentially what many would call the central character of the Old Testament. And I think the reason for that is it shows us that no matter who we are, what we've done, we can't mess up God's plan as long as we're willing to come back to Him. And that's what David did over and over again. Yes, he screwed up. He screwed up royally. But he came back. And he came back and he spoke to God. And it's, for me, it's so comforting because I told you earlier I got my girlfriend pregnant when she was 16. And I'm also divorced. And there's been many times in my life where I haven't felt like I was honoring God. There's been many times in my life where I didn't feel worthy of what I felt He was calling me to do. There have been many times in my life where I felt that the things I had done had made me irredeemable. Well, God, you don't understand. I was a pastor's kid. Look at what I did. I knew better. I knew better and I still did it. You can't really be calling me to do that. You're slightly confused. I think you've got me confused with somebody else. Has anybody ever had that conversation like in a prayer with God where you're like, no. I'm not that person. But yet he kept putting it on my heart, who He wanted me to be and what He wanted me to do. So God also knew David when He knew everything that David would mess up with. So when he knew that he would become the king, he called him a man after God's own heart. When he knew that he would sleep with another man's wife, he called him a man after God's own heart. When he knew that he would have that woman's husband killed, he called him a man after God's own heart. And so often we talk about either our inadequacies or our screw-ups and how that disqualifies us from being who Christ wants us to be and who we're being called to be. Often we use those as excuses to not step into that. We use it as, well, there's somebody better. There's a better speaker. There's somebody who hasn't screwed up yet. What if people found out what I did? And those are all lies either from Satan or even sometimes worse, lies that you're telling yourself, which are even harder to get over sometimes than those that you realize are coming from Satan. The lies that we tell ourselves are the ones that freeze us in shame and in guilt when God is intending what He's given us to be conviction, where it drives change, where it makes us step into another place and leave that behind. And in order to do that, we have to truly understand who God is. We have to understand that when we were just a child, He knew who He wanted us to be. We have to understand that when we were in the midst of our biggest screw up in our life, He knew exactly who He wanted us to be. We have to understand that just like the song that you just sang, He's running after us. No matter how fast we're running away, when you run a mile away, He's still just a step behind. When you run a mile away, He's still just a step behind. And that's how it's been my entire life. No matter how much I've screwed up, no matter how many times I've messed up, when you turn around, He's there. And that's powerful. Some of you feel like you're alone right now, like you've stepped into a place where nobody gets it, nobody understands. And I'll tell you that's a lie, because somebody's been there and done it. And somebody's got the t-shirt and they made it out the other side. And that's why it's important to be a part of a group of people trying to move the same direction that you would like to move. Because you find out the truth when you do that. The truth is introduced to you. You come across somebody who's been there and done it. When we say we're not worthy of going to church, it's often, I think it's often trying to keep us away from having the light turned on. The shame of, everybody's heard somebody say it, well, if I walk into church, I'll be struck dead. If that was true, we would all be dead. So God knew exactly who He was going to be before He messed up. This reminded me of, God's not very into cancel culture. But sadly, before cancel culture became a cultural thing, it was often a church thing. It was often a church thing, and that's sometimes why people won't walk through that back door. Because we in church sometimes make ourselves out to be bigger, better, badder, whatever, than other people because we go to church. When what we really need to realize is we need to take ourselves back to that place when Jesus saved us. And recognize that all we are is somebody who gave it over to Him. And if we truly get to understand that, we would want to introduce that to somebody else versus shunning them because of who they are. Yeah, I know I've heard Nathan say something similar. I want people to come into our church who still smell like Saturday night. And I want them to feel welcome when they do it. I know there were times where if I wouldn't have been allowed in because of the things that I've done, I don't know where I would be. But I've been blessed in my life to be a part of churches that for the most part have loved me despite myself. Other leaders who have given me opportunities despite my failures. And I want you to know that I truly and honestly believe that the leadership here from Nathan on down is that too. So don't be afraid. If you're sitting here and you're just here to check off a box, but you feel like you're not worthy of getting involved, step out of your comfort zone. So he knew me when I messed up and still called me to be who he wants me to be. And he knew you when you were messing up. And he still wants you to come forward if you haven't. And if you have, he wants you to step even further into being who he wants you to be. We often think that because there are consequences to our sins, that means that we aren't loved by Jesus. But consequences come with sin, period. David had consequences. Sometimes that doesn't get talked about. And his consequences actually went even beyond him. They were pretty intense. One of David's sons raped one of his sisters, one of his daughters. And then one of his other sons killed the son who raped the sister. The pregnancy that Bathsheba had, their first baby died. And it went on and on. One of his sons tried to kill David to become king. There were massive consequences due to David's failures and David's mess-ups. But that didn't mean that David wasn't loved, and it didn't mean that David couldn't love God. When we let go of our control and our guilt and our shame, that's often when we recognize who we are in Christ. When we can lay down the screw-ups that we've made, lay down even the consequences that are there. Because I can tell you, some of the things that I did wrong affected other people massively. And it had consequences on it, and sometimes that's some of the hardest things to get over. But the cool part is not only was David called a man after God's own heart by Samuel, before we knew who he was called a man after God's own heart hundreds of years later by a guy who had some pretty big mess ups himself, Paul. Paul's believed to have stood as some of the early Christians were assassinated, killed before he converted. In Acts 13, kind of 20 through 22, it says, and after that, and this is Paul kind of summarizing the transition from the judges, which came before Saul, up to David. And he says, and after that, he gave them judges until Samuel the prophet. And then they asked for a king. And God gave them Saul, the son of Kish, a man from the tribe of Benjamin, for 40 years. And when he had removed him, he raised up David to be their king, of whom he testified and said, I have found in David, the son of Jesse, a man after my heart, who will do all of my will. That almost sounds weird saying that afterwards. It was maybe even easier to say it before he had screwed up so bad. But yet, Paul knew exactly what David had done, and still says that God called him a man after his own heart. And why is it that Paul was able to do that? It's because, again, David was willing to fall on his face. David was willing to run back to God. So he had run a long way from him. But he turned back. And in Psalm 51, we get to see some of that. In Psalm 51, and bear with me, I'm going to read just a little bit. David says, have mercy on me, O God. According to your steadfast love, according to your abundant mercy, blot out my transgressions. Wash me thoroughly from my iniquity and cleanse me from my sin. For I know my transgressions, and my sin is ever before me. Against you and you only have I sinned, and done what is evil in your sight, so that you may be justified in your words and blameless in your judgment. Behold, I was brought forth in iniquity, and in sin did my mother conceive me. Behold, you delight in the truth in the inward being, and you teach me wisdom in the secret heart. Purge me with hyssop, and I shall be clean. Wash me, and I shall be whiter than snow. Let me hear joy and gladness. Let the bones that you have broken rejoice. Hide your face from my sins, and blot out my iniquities. Create in me a clean heart, O God, and renew a right spirit within me. Cast me not away from your presence, and take not your Holy Spirit from me. Restore to me the joy of your salvation, and uphold me with a willing spirit. Then I will teach my transgressors your ways, and sinners will return to you. Deliver me from blood guiltness, O God. O God of my salvation, and my tongue will sing aloud of your righteousness. O Lord, open my lips, and my mouth will declare your praise. For you will not delight in sacrifice, or I would give it. You will not be pleased with burnt offerings. The sacrifices of God are a broken spirit, a broken and contrite heart. O God, you will not despise. He just wants you. That's all he wants. He doesn't want your sacrifices. He doesn't want your burnt offerings. He doesn't want your money. He doesn't want your fame. He doesn't want your words. He simply wants you. He wants you to love him. He wants you to love him like a child loves when they don't know how to be unabashed. We're standing here before service, and Nathan was back over in the back looking for something, and Adelaide came running up and about ran over him and scared him. And it reminded me of when I would walk in the back door of the home when my kids were little. And some of you, I'm sure, have had this happen too, where you walk in after a long day's work and your kids run up, "Daddy, Daddy." It's a pure love of somebody just running to their father. That's what he wants. He just wants you to love him. And he wants you to tell others about that love. There's nothing more powerful than that. And if you aren't sure what your purpose is, it's not easy, but it is simple. It's to love him and to tell others about him. How that looks for you could be different than how it looks for somebody else, but it's all really simple. So what's the name he's giving you? That's what this is all coming around to. He called David a man after God's own heart, despite everything. That might be the inverse of what you would think if you ran into David during the consequences of what was going on. You probably wouldn't have recognized him as a man after God's own heart. You probably wouldn't have thought of that being a nickname that God would give him in that moment. And I find it interesting because I think that that's exactly the name that God wants us to give us. Because David is the only one who knows what that means in reality. The fact that he was called a man after God's own heart. David understands what that means. Because he understands the lows that he went through. We saw the like top part of everything that happened, but I imagine what happened behind the scenes that didn't get written about. How many other ways did he potentially try to kill Uriah before he figured out how to solve his problem? How many other lies were told in the midst of it all? We'll never know that, and it doesn't really matter. Because he was still called a man after God's own heart. Our new name is often the opposite of the lies that we tend to believe about ourselves. I have a rock that sits on my bedside table at my house. Actually, I have two. And on one of them it says worthy. Because I've struggled with that. Feeling worthy. Because there's been times in my life when I've believed lies, not only from Satan, but from myself. And the other rock says redeemed. Because I believed lies that because of what I had done, I wasn't redeemable. I knew better and I still did it. I knew what was right and I chose to do wrong. Paul writes about that in Romans 7. Doing the things that he hates instead of the things that he loves. So if you're feeling unworthy, know that God calls you worthy. If you're feeling unlovable, you're loved by the person who defines love. If you're feeling weak, in God you're strong. If you feel like you're just too big of a sinner, we all are. But you're a sinner saved by grace, or you can be. No sin is too big for Jesus, who stretched out his arms and bled for you. If you feel irredeemable, just like me, you're redeemed by the Most High God. And if you believe the lie that your sin is unforgivable, forgiveness is just the beginning. The band can go ahead and make their way up if they would like. In Revelations 2:7, John writes, "He who has an ear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches. To the one who conquers, I will give some of the hidden manna, and I will give him a white stone and a new name written on the stone that no one knows except the one who receives it." There's a story behind that, and in the courts at the time, when somebody came up to be found guilty or innocent, it said that the judges had two stones, and once they had heard all the arguments for each side, they would push one forward, and they would push forward a black stone if you were guilty, and they would push forward a white stone if you were innocent. Innocent. You aren't just forgiven if you accept His grace and His mercy. You're innocent. That's something that we as humans can't understand, right? Because we're only innocent if we didn't do it. But that's not how God sees it. That's not how God sees you. God sees you as innocent once you've accepted the grace and the mercy that He gives you through Jesus on the cross. And sometimes even once we're Christians, we struggle with that. Everything that I've told you I did wrong, I did after I was a Christian. I got saved at 8 years old. I know I did. There's no doubt. Basically, the only screw up I ever did before that, I think, was being disobedient to my parents. Innocent. That's such a strong word. When we can actually believe that, when we can actually understand what being innocent means in the eyes of God, I think that's when we truly start to believe and understand who God is in our life. And only then can we actually understand the new name that He wants to give us. Because the new name that He wants to give us is defined by who He is and not who we are. I'm not worthy because I'm worthy, because I did something that made me worthy. I'm worthy because of Him. I'm not redeemable because of the fact that I work with youth or I'm given the opportunity to do good deeds, because I still screw up. I'm redeemable because Jesus stretched out His arms and allowed Himself to be nailed to a cross. And my sins were washed white as snow, which I think is why a white stone is potentially used. So to truly understand, to truly get what your new name is, you've got to understand who God is. And the only way to do that is to delve in, to dive in, to walk alongside somebody who you see and you feel like is where you want to be, to take part with a group who seems to be walking in the direction that you want to walk. People don't become who they want to be or accomplish the things they want to accomplish by themselves. Even golfers, right? Golf's a single-person sport. But they work with many people to become the best at what they do. I'm going to come down and we're going to do something a little different this week. And I'm going to lay some white rocks down here. And some of you have already thought of a name that only you understand. The reason why, even though you know the definition of the word worthy, but I'm the only one who knows what that means to me. You know the definition of the word redeemable, but I'm the only one who knows every single thing that I'm redeemed from. And so I'm going to lay these rocks out, and I'm going to challenge you. If you don't know what name you want to write on it yet, come grab it. If you already know what name you're going to write on it as soon as you get home from church, come grab it. Because sometimes we need something to look at. We need something to hold. We need something to, when we start believing that we're unworthy again, to go and say, I wrote that word there. Not because I wrote it, but because God gave it to me. We did this years ago with our youth, and it was a powerful moment of some people realizing some lies for the first time ever, I think. Because when you're so focused on the negative, sometimes you can't even recognize the truth. When you're so focused on the lies that you're telling yourself, and it's just become almost a part of who you are, you can't recognize the truth. So I'm going to lay these rocks out, and the band's going to come, and they're going to sing, and I would ask you to come and grab one when you're ready.